We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas, it's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
It's no secret that the ongoing territory dispute between Israel and Palestine is bloody and violent, and it is widely agreed that this conflict ought to be resolved as peacefully as possible. However, this fight has expanded far beyond the Middle East and become a worldwide issue. Everyone has an opinion, everyone is taking a side, and everyone is deeply invested in the outcome. Unfortunately, almost no one understands the actual issue. While this conflict is a present-day concern, its roots trace all the way back to biblical times. In fact, the fates of these two nations are so tightly intertwined that it seems impossible to separate them, and even the Bible offers evidence to support both sides of the argument. Today, they are caught in a bloody conflict over who ought to possess the land, and both sides seem convinced that the only way to get what they want is to wipe out the other completely.
Nearly everything we know about Israel's founding can be found in the Hebrew Bible, which labels Abraham as the origin of Israel. Even the name Israel is thought to come from his son Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel by God in the Bible. Later, the descendants of Abraham were enslaved by the Egyptians in the land of Canaan, a region very close to the location of Israel today. In approximately 1000 BC, King Solomon constructed Israel's first holy temple, fulfilling the dreams of generations of Israelites. Not too long after, in the year 931 BC, the land was divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. However, the separation did not bring about peace in Israel. In fact, by the year 516, the Assyrians had invaded Israel and the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroying the temple. For several hundreds of years after that, Israel was in a state of constant turmoil as it was conquered and conquered again. From 1517 to 1917, the land was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. The Balfour Declaration, drafted by the British in the heat of World War I, suggested that the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in hopes that it would increase support for the Allies. When the Allies won World War I, the reign of the Ottoman Empire ended, and Great Britain took over Palestine until 1947, when Israel was made a state. Ever since 1948, the Jews and Arabs have engaged in bitter disputes and violent wars over the territory. Today, there are many areas divided between Israel and Palestine, as long as shared lands such as Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and the capital of both. While Israel does not officially recognize Palestine as a state, many other countries do, including 135 UN member nations. Outside nations have been pushing for a two-state solution, as the two nations coexisting seems implausible. The Prime Minister of Israel explains that while he supported the two-state solution, he felt that the nation would disagree. In addition, he has been accused of encouraging Jewish settlements in Palestinian areas, which only makes the disagreements worse.
On the other side of the argument is Palestine. The name Palestine comes from the Greek word Philistia, which was used to describe the Philistines, who occupied the region in the 12th century BC. Then, following the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, the region between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River became known as Palestine, although today much of that territory is Israel. Today, the regions that belong to Palestine are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, both of which have been occupied by Israel's military since 1967. In fact, 28 United Nations countries don't even recognize Israel, while many areas are claimed by both nations. The land of the ancient Israelites first came under Muslim control in the year 637, when it was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate. Then, from 1517 to 1917, it was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and later British occupation. In 1947, the British proposed to partition the land into two states, one for Jews and one for Arabs, with Jerusalem as a shared space. However, many of the Palestinians resented this plan, believing that they deserved a greater portion of the land due to having a larger population. In 1948, Britain withdrew, leaving the land as an Israeli state. Soon after, the Arab-Israel War ensued, which resulted in the Palestinians losing almost all of their territory. Consequently, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was formed as an attempt to regain some of the land which they believed Israel possessed illegitimately. In 1987, Palestine revolted. This revolt was called the First Intifada, and resulted in the Oslo Accords, signed in 1993. These accords were an agreement between Palestine and Israel, in which Palestine agreed to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, while Israel agreed to formally recognize the PLO as legitimate. In 1995, Oslo II laid out plans for the Israel army to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, resulting in complete Palestinian autonomy in those areas. It also made a schedule for the Palestinian Legislative Council elections. However, it ultimately failed to bring about an agreement, and there was still no peace. In the year 2000, the Second Intifada was triggered when a Jewish Israeli visited a mosque in Jerusalem. This was seen as a serious offense and set off 5 years of violence. In 2006, the group Hamas began winning elections. Hamas won a fight against the group controlling the PLO, Fatah, in 2007, laying claim to the area of Gaza. Hamas and Israel continued to fight each other many times since, often targeting citizens and using terrorist tactics. Hamas also repeatedly called for the destruction of Israel. In 2014, a unified Palestinian government was formed, but this was dissolved by 2019 due to continued internal power struggles, leaving Fatah in power in the West Bank and Hamas controlling the Gaza Strip. Today, much of the fighting is a result of the Israel government allowing its citizens to settle in areas occupied by Palestine. While many groups advocating for international rights consider this to be illegal, including multiple resolutions made by the UN, no conclusion has been reached yet. Another important thing to note is that the borders are still undefined, meaning that we have no way of knowing who is really trespassing. In 2018, the US Embassy moved to Jerusalem, increasing tensions even more. Protests at the Gaza-Israel border resulted in the deaths of many protesters, and in 2023, Hamas launched terrorist attacks on Israel, leading to a declaration of war.
One important side of this story that is often overlooked is the effects that the British and UN involvement had on the conflicts. British involvement began in 1917 when the British made two conflicting promises. They promised a united Arab country that would span most of the Middle East should the Turks be defeated. In addition, they promised the establishment of a Jewish national home in the very same area, in an attempt to win support in the war. However, when they defeated the Ottomans in 1918, they fulfilled neither promise. In 1920, the British claimed responsibility for Palestine under a UN mandate and allowed over 100,000 Jews to enter the country. However, during World War II, the British began to limit Jewish immigration in an attempt to quell Palestinian anger. This led to Jewish resistance, angry that their attempts to escape the Nazi regime into Palestine were being thwarted, and by 1945, the British were dealing with full-scale riots. In response, they were forced to send in 100,000 troops to deal with the outrage. In spite of all this unrest, British troops proceeded to carry out Operation Agatha in 1946, raiding Jewish agency offices and other buildings in Jerusalem. Many Jews who were suspected of being involved in the uprisings and accused of terrorist activity were arrested. Shortly after this, the British called together a conference of Jewish Arab leaders. However, the conference resulted in a deadlock, and the problem was handed over to the UN. In 1947, the UN recommended the partitioning of Palestine and the establishment of an Arab nation and a Jewish nation. Then, in May of 1948, the British gave up their mandate and left, leaving two warring nations behind them with no solution in sight. Instead, they left Israel and Palestine to themselves to fight out their disputes in the ensuing wars. Another factor that keeps people from fully understanding the issue at hand is the fact that the world is so divided over the issue. Israel and Palestine both have many allies in different countries. The United States, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand are all among countries that support Israel. Palestine also has many supporters, such as all 22 Arab League countries, most African Union countries, Ireland, Norway, Spain, Slovenia, Armenia, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Pakistan.
However, this fact often leads to making the media biased. Because so many countries are invested in the fate of these two nations, it can be hard to find unbiased media in order to learn the truth about what the situation in the Middle East is actually like. In addition, because most countries support one of the two nations, the media often tries to frame the other as the enemy and antagonist, when in reality neither is truly at fault for the conflict. For instance, because the US is allied with Israel, much of the media tells the story of Israel, framing Palestine in an ugly light. An example of this is a recent tweet from Trump which calls for immediate action against Palestine. With so much influence from the media in so many countries, the truth of what is really happening is foggy at best, and often the story is completely misrepresented to better support one side of the argument. Another important aspect of the conflict is the fact that religion is involved. If it were merely a matter of territory disputes, the disagreement would likely be less bitter and violent. However, many Jews believe that the land was promised to them by God and is rightfully theirs, but most Muslims see the conflict as necessary to liberate the Holy Land. Because religion is such an integral part of culture and so meaningful to individuals, this fact adds another layer of complexity to the conflict. Now, it is not merely a fight over who ought to occupy the territory, but a disagreement on deeply important matters of religious doctrine between two groups who hate each other. In conclusion, this war is not a simple problem, and so there can be no simple solution. However, choosing sides based on biased media representations and incomplete knowledge of the history doesn't bring us any closer to solving the issue at hand. Instead, we ought to work to resolve the disagreements in a way that respects both religion without villainizing either side.